Mouthy Infidel really doesn't understand the measure of what economic success is. He just assumes that because the Soviet Union had a high level of productivity, that because of a high GDP, that this automatically meant that they had a high standard of living. Having a high GDP doesn't necessarily mean to say that what you were producing was of any value to that of the end consumer. You could produce a hell of a lot, but who's to say that what you're producing was going to value of the consumer? In fact, the reality was you found a lot of surplus waste. That is to say that the Soviet Union was overproducing, and they did this on many accounts.
Furthermore, I could very easily argue that there has been examples of efficient planning based on the assumptions of the labor theory of value. Take, for example, the USSR, which for many years saw very fast and reliable economic growth and innovation.
There are two Soviet Union economists that I'm going to read a quote to you on that basically state about the problem they had with regards to prices in the Soviet Union, that gives you an example of just how inefficient it was and what a catastrophic failure this economy was. Two Soviet Union economists, Nikolai Shmelev and Vladimir Popov, described a situation in which their government raised the price it would pay for moleskins, leading hunters to get and sell more of them. State purchases increased, and now all the distribution centres are filled with these pelts. Industry is unable to use them all, and they often rot in warehouses before they can be processed. The Ministry of Light Industry has already requested Goskomtson twice to lower purchasing prices, but the question has not been decided yet. And this is not surprising. Its members are too busy to decide. They have no time. Besides setting prices on these pelts, they have to keep track of another 24 million prices. Now that's the problem with setting 24 million other prices. It's too impossible for a central planner to work out all that information. When the price was set high, it created that surplus waste problem. As noted, a market, through consumer demand, would naturally see the price fluctuate and drop. In other words, the consumer demand would drop, the price would fall, and that means they're able to try and sell off as much as they can. The information of the losses from that in a normal price system would mean they can stop producing what is not selling. But that information goes out the window through that of price fixing, through that of, the Soviet Union government fixing a higher price and messing up that information. And what results in what you see is overproduction of what consumers don't want, creating surplus waste problems and leaving, such resources to waste. And that's precisely what you've seen. And this is coming from the two Soviet Union economists. Another quote that we can look at from both Shmelev and Popov, the two Soviet Union economists, they said, "No matter how much we wish to organise everything rationally, without waste, no matter how passionately we wish to lay all the bricks of the economic structure tightly, with no chinks in the mortar, it is not yet within our power." And to give you an idea of just how inefficient the Soviet Union economy was. Now, for example, when we look at economic efficiency, you can look at Hong Kong, that has practically no natural resources, yet despite that has managed to lift the masses out of poverty, turning a tiny small fishing village from extreme poverty to a city that's arguably the richest city in the world. Whereas if you were to contrast that to socialist India from 1947 after it gained independence and on the path to the 1990s, it wasted about 70% of its natural resources, yet despite that, most of the people were living in extreme poverty. Likewise, you see Venezuela sitting with the world's largest proven oil reserves, etc. They've got a large quantity of resources, but despite having all of that, the people are living in extreme poverty. Now, this is no different to the Soviet Union with such inefficiency. You can produce a lot, have a high GDP, that doesn't necessarily mean to say that your standards of living are going to be anything spectacular. So to quote what Shmelev and Popov go on to say here, to make 1 ton of copper we use about 1000 kilowatts hours of electrical energy, as against 300 in West Germany. To produce 1 ton of cement, we we use twice the amount of energy that Japan does. In other words, West Germany and Japan were far more efficient with their resources than that of the Soviet Union. That's what constitutes economic success.
Which only ended up stagnating and eventually collapsing because of external factors such as embargoes, disastrous Gorbachev policies, which caused massive inflation and bankrupted the state, and so on.
To explain further on the whole inflationary problem with socialism and why that's the natural state of it, first understand that again money's only going to come from two places. One is the private sector and two is the printing press. Now if you don't have the money coming from the private sector and you're forced to run that of the printing press, by increasing the quantity of the paper by running the printing press, the more paper you have in circulation, the lower the valuation of the currency. That's because it's every £1 and every $1 to the value of the product. So for every $1 that you print, or £1 that you print in circulation, there's a 1 plus debt added to the currency. This is inflationary, like that of inflating a balloon. The more you inflate the quantity of the currency, the less value that paper holds. So you face a currency devaluation. This in turn drives up the inflationary costs, such as the cost of your goods and services. This is why the paper became worthless in that of Venezuela. They dropped the currency because it was no longer worth anything to them. They could carry around a lot of that paper and it would get them very little for it in exchange. So that's why you could have a lot of paper money, but that doesn't make you rich. What makes wealth is that of material wealth. That's what happens when you do away with that of the private sector. So it's the natural state that you're going to end up in. Another thing is that if you're going to raise the tax rates in order to pay for all of the socialism, then you're going to have a lower level of productivity. That's the natural state of it. There's less being produced. Since there's less being produced, there becomes a shortage problem. The demand far exceeds that of what is actually available. The less that's being produced, the costs drive up. So being faced with that of a shortage problem of lower levels of productivity through strangling the economy half to death through higher tax rates to pay for all the socialism, and of course running the printing press, the inevitable consequence of that is the fact that you are 100% going to face hyperinflation. Not even up for debate, it's understanding basic economics.
The claim that Marx debunked the labor theory of value with his thesis on worker alienation is a strange one. Marx never claimed that work had to be unalienated in order to produce value. Value, by Marx's definition, is simply the amount of socially necessary labor time congealed within a commodity. Never once did he say that the socially necessary labor time couldn't be alienated. In fact, Marx's analysis of capitalism begins at the analysis of value and the values in commodities which are created by alienated labor.
Moving back to the argument on the labour theory of value under Marxism and the argument on the time spent and of course the quantity of labour and producing something equal to that of what it's going to be in terms of price, the value or whatever, he doesn't understand the very fact that you could spend a lot of time doing something and spend as much labour as you want, have as much quantity in labour as you want producing something. That doesn't necessarily mean to say that it's going to be of any value. This is why Milton Friedman in China questioned why he's not using machinery, why is he using shovels? And he says, at the end of the day, why don't you just use teaspoons or whatever? If you're going to produce, and if you're digging a big hole, it would take you longer to do so using teaspoons, more labour in order to do so. That doesn't mean anything. What value is really determined by is the end value to the consumer. Is it going to be any value to that of, the people in terms of their material wealth? He doesn't take that into account. He doesn't acknowledge the fact, and this is the contradiction, the Soviet Union, with the mass production of the pelts, judging by his logic, a lot of time was spent and labour was spent on producing the pelts. But the pelts were not in demand. That's why you saw the surplus waste. That's why they were left to rot in warehouses. because the demand simply was not there. What you saw was, from the real world in practice, consumers' demand contradicted that. The demand wasn't there for something that time and, of course, quantity was spent on. So this is what I mean about the Marxist labour theory of value. You're really only going to know value through consumer demand, and that is contradictory of that of socialism completely.
Also, esoteric entity claims that profit isn't theft because workers aren't coerced. Now, I'm not sure if esoteric entity doesn't understand the basic nature of capitalism, or if he doesn't understand the definition of coercion, or both, but capitalism very obviously, definitionally, intrinsically requires coercion. Now, the very dictionary definition of coercion is, quote, the practice of persuading someone to do something by use of force or threats. The threat of starvation is inherent to capitalism because it is the threat of starvation that causes people to participate in wage labor.
Arguably the most silly thing that he came out and said is that capitalism is based on coercion, that if you do not work you'll be left to starve. That is completely ludicrous, because no matter what system you live under, whether you live under communism, or whether you live under, fascism, or feudalism, or theocracy, if you do not work, food is not going to be there on your table for you to be able to survive in the first place. You need to be able to work in order to get the food out of the ground. You need to be able to work in order to produce such things, like to produce the food, etc., in order for people to survive in the first place. People don't work for free. That's just how it goes. You need a profit motive, you need incentives, and that's what prices give the market. Even if he was to go down the road of the moneyless based economy, again, it's faced with the problem of the economic calculation problem. You don't have the information of prices. This isn't what he's arguing, however. This is the argument that he's saying that capitalism's based on coercion simply because the fact that you need to work for something in order to get food. Well, excuse me, what do you think you have to do under socialism? You would have to work anyway in order to get food. When it goes on to the argument of exploitation, again, under socialist economies in the real world, there's no economies more exploitative of the workers than that of socialist economies. And that's always been the case. Capitalism enables people to continuously improve their wages and their material wealth, and people go and choose to work in these companies, or they can go and work in their own company. There's no coercion involved for you to go and work for a company, because no one holds a gun to your head and says that you must work for me. So on to the final argument on the laws of supply and demand. He erroneously tries to conflate this with this subjective theory of value. Now, they're two completely separate arguments, and he even tries to correlate Marxism, Karl Marx, as if to say that he did not reject supply and demand. That makes no rational sense. In order to oppose a free market where consumers drive demand, prices are determined through the laws of supply and demand, that is rejecting the free market. And the argument on supply and demand is a separate issue from the argument with subjective value, and it's not something scientific. You do not need scientific proof in order to tell that people out there by evidence all have different needs and wants. This is something of a free market determining and driving what prices are, and determining value through consumers' own demand and reflection to what is in supply. And if there's a shortage of supply and greater demand, there's going to be a higher cost. Supply and demand is going to determine all of this, and that's driven by the free market. That's a completely separate issue altogether on arguing on this theory of, subjective value that Adam Smith was speaking of. Whereas Karl Marx did not believe in anything to do with supply and demand. That's why they try to fix prices. That's why they think price is something knowable, or that value is something knowable. So I hope I've covered enough in the argument. His video was pretty lengthy, and I tried to cover as much as I could. If there's anything that I have missed out, then of course you can comment in the comment section below. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, and of course favourite, share, whatever. and thank you for watching. I shall talk to you later. Cheers.